And now we're going to move on to our third speaker, who is no stranger to this group, and the reason probably why we're all here in many ways. Henry has joined the adolescent health team at Sunshine Coast, and he's going to talk about a launchpad for limit testing in adolescent healthcare. Not sure what that means, but I'm sure it will be amazing.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay respects to the owners of the land, their elders, past, present, and emerging. And hey, this is an adolescent medicine session, so emerging elders is really what we're all about, right? So, this talk is about the launchpad for limit testing. And unlike Dr. Promus, I'm not an experienced adolescent medicine physician. And like Ange, I'm not an expert in my field. And like Michelle, I don't have a long and storied career of expertise. So, I'm going to take the complete opposite approach. And the reason for that is that I'm doing the work day to day, and like everyone here, I just want to get better at it. Most of my training in adolescence I did with Professor Simon Denny at the Marta Young Adult Health Service. And Dr. Denny, when asked about how to become a good adolescent physician, he said it's about swimming in the data. And Simon knows, because through the Youth New Zealand studies for the last 20-something years, he has genuinely generated that data. So if you learned at medical school that the most protective thing you have in your life as a young person is an adult who loves you and that you love, he showed that in data. And that's amazing. I don't have those kind of chops. So I'm going to go back to first principles. And in adolescent medicine, the four things we think about, the lenses through which we see the young people in our care are that they have strengths. Our care is strengths-based, which is really tricky because most of medicine is about deficits, being not enough. But for every person we meet and every person we care for, they have strengths. And one way that we get to find that out is we see them in context. I'm going to talk briefly about Head's assessment in a little bit if you give me the chance. But seeing a young person in the context of their life is incredibly important. The care that we provide for young people is best done through relationships. And anybody who works in emergency is really, really good at quickly establishing a strong therapeutic relationship with somebody, because in a few seconds you're going to jab metal into their arm. And you want them to not run away, but you also want them to tell you, as Dr. Rhodes was saying on stage earlier today, in medicine we're secret keepers. And so that's predicated on relationships. And finally, it's about skills. These skills can be around self-management of a chronic illness. These skills can be going down to the shop to buy bread for the family for the next day. Skills are broad. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but when I think of skills, particularly in the way that our big health systems work, it's that 15 and 16-year-olds, they manage their school diaries. They know when sports training is. They know when school holidays are. But when it comes to their medical appointment, we message their mum. And I think if you all went back and made one systemic level change to your health service tomorrow, it would be for young people, that is adolescents and young adults, that when we're sending out appointment reminders to anybody over the age of 13, it goes to their mobile phone and their parents' mobile phone. That's the one change. And I think that would change our system. Okay. We talked really briefly about that really tricky situation for pregnancy in a 13-year-old. And my wise colleague, Dr. Smith, mentioned Gillett competence. And I think sometimes when it comes to competence and autonomy, that we kind of do ourselves a disservice by learning about Gillett competence in about week 3 of medical school, or very, very early on in our careers. Because from that point onwards, we kind of stop thinking. Now, I'm lucky enough to have 3 children, and the 2 youngest share a birthday. And anybody who has ever done toilet training knows that autonomy doesn't start at 16. And if the child in your family is capable of walking to the toilet, doing a poo, wiping their bum, pulling up their pants and coming back and talking to you, they have inside thoughts and inside actions for which they do not need your consent. At the other end of things, if you're buying a house, you should talk to another responsible adult. That's competence and autonomy. And it is two sides of the same coin, and that's about confidentiality as well. Okay? So think about that really hard when you're becoming the secret keeper, what secrets you're keeping for somebody. And the secret in all of that is that if you want to see a young person through their own context and not their parents, you need to separate them. And that's really hard. I've had the luxury of working in both the pediatric environment and the young adult medicine based in an adult hospital environment. And I can tell you for certain that this is much easier when you work with adults. Because you say the patient's name and they stand up and walk into your clinic room. Then they look at you awkwardly and say, "Can my mum come?" But in pediatrics, we have a different default mode. We see young people and their parent every single time. And it is, unless we do it routinely and regularly, the act of separating a lioness from her cub or a lion from their cub is a challenge. It is scary. So, like every other scary procedure that we do, like shoving metal into somebody's arm, asking two people to sit in different rooms is just something that we need to practice. Again, because I'm not in the usually first three clinicians or first three doctors to see a young person and their family, I have a bit of luxury because I get to say I work in an adolescent medicine clinic, and the way that we do care for anybody who is an adolescent is that we love to see young people by themselves. And then we meet with the family together. And that's because healthcare is confidential. When I work in a handwritten system, I allegedly take notes. And I can't type as fast as I can talk, but I will write notes that are a fair representation of our conversation. Because I can't write that fast, it probably won't be direct quotes. But those notes, they're confidential. I can't share them with your mates, or your school, or your mum, or your dad, or your carer, or your partner, without your express permission, except in three situations. And those three situations are, if you're going to kill someone, if someone is hurting you, or you're thinking about killing yourself. And usually when I talk about killing somebody else, most young people laugh because it is so frankly absurd. But I also go on to say that if you want to tell me those things, I can hear it. And there's nothing that you could say that would stop me wanting to take care of you. If I need to override your confidentiality, then we'll talk together what that looks and feels like. And to me, that's something that I've introduced reasonably recently in my conversation with young people because I don't like the word breaking confidentiality. It feels just wrong. But I also want the person to know that in my role as their secret keeper, that there are some secrets that need more support than just I can offer. It is my professional responsibility to hold on, to do the right thing with those secrets. So I say that again and again and again. And as you can tell, it rolled off the tongue pretty easily just then. And I challenge you guys to be in the same place. That whenever you see somebody who has started high school, to start having the conversation. Because even if there is no medical reason, there is a social reason. That 12-year-old that you met who's at high school, they probably had orientation week at the start of the year, and they probably had a buddy who was in grade 12 or grade 13 if you're from New Zealand. They didn't meet that buddy on the first day, they met them kind of on the second or third day. And when they go back to school at the start of their second year of high school, their buddy is gone. Why? They've transitioned into adult life. And that's a message and a skill that we can be giving to young people from the age of 12. I'm not accusing them of having the capacity for abstract thought at 12, but there's a possibility. That's something that's more entrenched as you progress into middle adolescence. So, a launchpad for limit testing. I really enjoyed Joe Tully's talk on the first day about social media and sex. I saw a lot of uncomfortable people in that session, and that was amazing. We became, as a cohort, more worried about mobile phones for young people. But I want to differentiate those two things. We care for young people. You guys have self-selected to come to the conference, and you've self-selected to this plenary. So I'm guessing you want to care for young people. But we also need to manage the difference between care and worry. And the best way to sate our worry, we learn very early in our medical careers, is to obtain data. So these are the limits. These are the limits. These are the social limits. These are the physiologic limits, which is just physics and tubes. These are the limits that young people can survive within. These are the limits that we get taught in our training. When something breaches a limit, we must act. the acute score is 5, we make a call. If the acute score is 9, we call them met. Again, physiologic examples. Or if a young person has a bruise, then we make a report. Now, our challenge in adolescent medicine is to move our limits to here. Because we believe that with good guidance and the space to grow, as Yanni Getzmer talked about the other day, that young people will regress to the mean, that most young people will be okay. And so I do a lot of listening in my job and not a lot of acting. But when I act, I really have to act. And that's about tolerance. And that's because young people are growing. Now, with these 4 principles in mind, and the remaining time allotted us today, you have 4 cards in front of you. And my job is, because I'm the 8th speaker in adolescent health in this conference, is to give you guys the choice of what else you want to hear about. Because we've heard about sex, we've heard about eating disorders, and we've heard a little bit about mobile phones. So these are kind of what's left. And I was just going to talk you through some operating frameworks that I use when thinking about these things and caring for young people. Because this is in service of what Marty Steer spoke about yesterday as being a generalist plus. And the reason that I spend all this time with Ange and the wonderful team at Biala is that now those sexual health skills I don't deploy in a sexual health clinic, I just use as a generalist. So, I'm going to close my eyes and you guys can all hold up a card and then we'll choose what we talk about next. So the options are talking more about drugs and substance use, talking about self-harm, talking about gaming, more pastimes, and then the starters, which we've kind of alluded to, which is about how you get started on sections of the heads. Because as Ange spoke to, it's pretty easy to start talking about anal and oral sex once you've got crossed the question of, are you having sex? And sometimes we just need that first starter, the methyl dopa for our heads assessment. Okay. Holding them up on 3, 1, 2, 3. Blue, 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 blue.
I see blues.
Bit of pink. Blues.
I see blues.
Okay. Most young people have thought about self-harm or harming themselves. I saw a statistic yesterday that said 93%. And we know that, so firstly, going back to setting these limits, most self-harm is not with suicidal intent. Most self-harm spontaneously resolves before the age of 22. You are more likely to do it if you're female than male, and the mean age of onset is about 15. So grade 9 or grade 10, depending on how much social distress you have. Underpinning that, I tend to not go straight for asking about cutting, because everyone knows about cutting. So I tend to say, have you ever been so frustrated or felt like you wanted to hurt yourself? Was that hair pulling or face punching? And some young people will go, oh, it's that. And that's the whole conversation. And if I was to start with cutting, I would have lost them, because that is intolerable, that is profoundly taboo. But a subtle punch in the face, what's the deal with that? And so then this becomes a conversation about what underpins self-harm. Self-harm is ultimately a representation of distress. And my job really is to understand the distress. We can talk about scars, we can talk about scar management, we can talk about infections and presentation to hospital, and where do you cut and why do you cut. Dr. Boyd referred to some young people who struggle with food and intake and personality vulnerabilities. And one of the questions I ask in self-harm around that is, do you hide your scars or do you show them? It's a bit of a broad brush question, it has no evidence behind it, but I think that it's a helpful thing to understand. And then I'll talk about harm minimization. Are you using clean blades? Where do you keep them? If you have a preschool-aged child, please don't keep them under your bed. Have you ever spoken to your parents about this? It's a really tricky question about where to sit in that overriding confidentiality when it comes to self-harm. Because if you're taking away a young person's only way of managing their distress, what could happen next? Immediately after that, I'll segue into a conversation about suicide. As we learned for our College of Physicians, College of Pediatricians exams, young people from the age of 8 understand the unequivocal, irreversible nature of death. Understand the irreversible nature of death, then it's not a great stretch to apply death to yourself, being self-dead, suicide. And it is normal to think about death. So if you're standing at the top of a tall building and you look down and you think, that'd be quick, that's thinking about death. If you stood at the bus station and the bus came past just a bit too fast, you think, gee, that'd be quick. That is a normal thought to have. Okay? If you don't want those thoughts and they're constantly in your mind, even if you have no plan on acting on them, they're intrusive thoughts. And they may be very distressing, and I want you to talk about that. But at the other end, if you have access to means, if you're making plans and giving your stuff away and thinking on this time at this day, I'd like to know. And I'll ask young people where they sit on that spectrum most days and when the last time they felt like completing suicide was, or killing themselves. Words that I'm reasonably comfortable using and that we should all use because that's what's happening. And that is not hurting yourself and that's not self-harm. Okay. We've got 3 left. What else would you like to talk about? I'm seeing some...
There's a few greens. There's more greens than pinks.
Greens, gaming,
greens
fantastic.
number 2 and then...
All right. Gaming. I grew up, I had my adolescence in the time of World of Warcraft. And I played it once. But I know that people who did, for them it was pro-social and they developed a profound connection through their guild or their tribe. So for me, any gaming or mobile phone use, it's got to be functional, it's got to be pro-social, and it's got to be safe enough. So when it comes to gaming, 85% of adults in Australia have engaged in some form of gaming, be that on your mobile phone, at an arcade or online. When a young person says, I do gaming, I don't groan like many people just did internally. I said, what kind of games do you play? Oh, really cool. And thinking about those big buckets of first-person shooters or collaborative games or puzzles, do you play by yourself or do you play in a team? Because I think we all know that playing World of Warcraft, which is an open world game where you role play and you have different characters and different skills and you work with a team, that's going to be better for a young person than playing hours of solitaire. So if you grew up in the 90s or the noughties and you played solitaire, that is an isolative game that you never shared with anybody, and if you played it for more than an hour, then you're probably doing the wrong thing. And in fact, Fortnite could be considered a more sociable experience, and Minesweeper would be considered a more creative experience. And really, I'm just challenging everybody in the room to ask the next question after games. The other thing that I know is that, like many things, we can understand the socioeconomics through gaming a little bit. That upper middle class and upper class kids tend to have, young people have PCs that can be privately customizable, whereas lower socioeconomic status young people tend to have console games that they can share and transport if they're in a reasonably mobile environment. And then you often don't have the latency to be fast with those online games, so you get killed faster, so you don't rack up points. So like everything else, it becomes a social determinant of health depending on what platform you're playing on. But the one challenge is, ask what games, ask who with, and even if there's not chat in the game, are they talking to their mates at the same time? Because what a wonderful experience. It's pro-social, it's creative, it's problem solving. Hey, these are the tasks that we want young people to, the skills that we want young people to have. Okay, so look, I'm out of time. I'm grateful that together we've challenged ourselves to differentiate between care, which we all have, and worry that we want less of. That we've been able to think about the grey space between the blue dashed line and the red dashed line, where we can spend a bit more time existing to understand young people in the context that they live, and that we can have a bit more of a launchpad for that limit setting. Thank you.
Amazing as always, Henry. Are there any questions?
Did you just wave?
No, we want to use the microphones for the recording.
Thanks, Henry. As an avid solitaire player myself in my youth, I feel personally triggered, but anyway, we'll move on from that. So I guess my question is you talked about kind of resetting those limits. As clinicians, do you have any tips or tricks for us to reset our own limits, which are often already moulded by our training and by our own kind of social backgrounds and upbringings ourselves, to kind of reframe that for our young people?
That's a really good question, Eddie. Thank you. I think there's two parts to that. I acknowledge that I'm giving this spiel reasonably early in my career by comparison to some of the other wisdom that we have around us. So I suspect that some of those limits are tolerated through wisdom and experience of a career. I feel like the opportunity to work in lots of different areas in a short period of time also established tolerance for those limits, because you can kind of push on them harder and harder, and we've probably all had that feeling of wringing a specialty out of ours for a specialty patient that we're quite worried about, and the specialists go, oh yeah, cool, thanks. And you can tell they care, but they're not worried. So being explicit about which limit you're pushing and which area you're learning in, and that way, again, with that higher fidelity of data, and so if we're talking about substances, which substance, when and why, that just kind of pushes it rather than this general I use substances.
If I could just add to that, Henry, I think time and wisdom, time and experience does bring wisdom, definitely, in terms of just sheer numbers. However, don't underestimate the intensity and the depth in which, all of you go through in training. You come out of training as incredible experts in the field that which you're in. And even after one rotation in a particular area, people are, you're expert in that area because you've been doing it day in, day out, all day, every day. So, I don't want you to think that you don't come out as experts when you're young in your career. You really are. And you have a different eye, often not the jaundiced eye of the old experienced person. But yeah, that tolerance, it's almost like desensitization. It does come with time. And I can think of many examples when you were talking, and I had a patient in terms of poker face. Oh my God, she would try and just shock me every single time. And I would sit there going, yeah, it's all good. And I'd walk out and go, oh my God, and she'd be talking about stuff that I had no idea what she was talking about. And, and she ended up becoming a nurse, and a very competent one many, many years later. And we had this conversation and had a laugh. So there's experience at so many different levels, but time and experience is not the only arbiter of tolerance, is what I wanted to say. Any other questions? Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I've come back.
Sorry.
Thank you. So this one might be slightly different based on state, but I guess my question is about, confidentiality underpins a lot of adolescent and young adult medicine. What happens, do parents still have rights to request medical records? So even though we are obviously not obliged to share any of that information with parents, if they're, under 16, can a parent still write to that hospital health service and say, I'd like access to my child's medical records?
I don't know the answer to that, and I should. I'll look it up.
Technically, yes, they can. My experience with most hospitals, and I guess I'm coming from a Victorian view, but most hospitals will actually check with the team, and the team does have an opportunity to redact certain parts of the information. But when I'm writing something in the medical record, and certainly in an electronic medical record that I think is confidential, I usually put in massive bold letters, capitalised, confidential, not for distribution. And most medical records do have shattered, a glass. It might be different in different systems, but there'll be a glass pane that you have to put a password into to read certain, very sensitive information. And that's usually a flag to the Freedom of Information Act team in the hospital to question whether that information can be shared. And my experience also is that they try, the team at the hospital try to do the right thing and not share confidential information with families.
Great, thank you.
I think also, following on from that, one of the challenges with adolescent care is because we have essentially accessible medical record in many places, even the documentation of a robust heads assessment can be quite vulnerability inducing for a young person because it can lead them to intrasystemic prejudice. Right, we want to believe that on our best days we provided non-judgmental healthcare for young people, and certainly that's my aim every moment. But sometimes the data that is there receives judgment from our colleagues. And so there's a few ways around that. Obviously, having a culture where that's not the case is great. But sometimes having the medical notes in a way that you can interpret now and in the future, but takes a sort of slightly higher cognitive load. And I've seen that in sort of some sexual health clinics when I'm documenting a sexual health history for a 16-year-old. It doesn't need to be easily readable to every member of the healthcare team because you're taking that history for a particular reason for you and you have that information that's important data in the same way, but you don't want that to be able to flick into almost that medical voyeurism that have people go, oh my God, check out the 16-year-old, all these things happened, oh my God. Like, let's go for non-judgmental but appropriate and think about how we share that.
Can I also, though, extend what you're talking about? One of the issues around confidentiality is, and where we sometimes get into trouble with families, is that young people are absolutely adamant they cannot share a particular piece of information with their family. And as clinicians, we're kind of going, God, we wish this kid would talk about this with their family. And I actually work really hard with young people to explore why they don't want to share the information. And there are all sorts of different motivations. And over time, I often do communicate this with parents. We're not trying to keep information from you. We're trying to help this young person become a competent young person who can navigate the health system themselves and moving forward into adulthood. But I really do try and work with that young people to explore, to explore how can we share this information with your family, and often we'll offer, do you want me to help, do you want me to tell this information to your family? Do you want to sit with me? We will do it together. I will tell you, pre-plan what we will say, how we will say it, how much I can say, and I get quite explicitly, do you want me to tell them this? Do you want me to tell them that? Do you want and I don't always offer to tell them, but there's a whole piece of therapeutic work that goes alongside, how to divulge important information that actually, can be supportive for that young person. And if parents feel confident that you have their young person's well-being, really at the top of your motivation, which is the same as theirs, by and large, you don't, I don't think I can think of many situations where parents have insisted that they know what's going on when we've kept information private. I could count on one hand in a 25-year career, how many times parents have not been happy to be thrown out of the room. And I say, I'm going to throw you out of the room. And it's a joking thing, but we explain confidentiality, and so I'll talk to you, and then I'll throw you out of the room, and then we'll get you back, and whatever. And parents are quite okay with it.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Katie. I'm a FASM from Gosford, New South Wales. I do adults and kids together, and can I just say thank you so much for such an enlightening talk. I think I'm a junior consultant, and something I've really noticed as I've moved through my training is you get less and less opportunities to witness those pearls, those little turns of phrase that you use, and those little openers and starters that I kept throwing my little red card up but didn't get seen. So I'm just going to jump in here now and say, is there anything that you employ yourself or you've really noticed a colleague say or do that you go, I really like that, I'm going to take that and incorporate it into my own practice because I'm missing that a little bit as a consultant?
I mean, that's how Don't Forget the Bubble started. Honestly, as a registrar, it was the same, and in different fields, it's the same. So thank you for that observation. I would also respond to that to say that everything's stolen. These are other people's spiels that I've just kind of mashed together through the great luxury of working in different places. I think the confidentiality spiel I adapted from Simon Denny, and he's really explicit in saying the first time you say that with everybody in the room, because you're communicating it to the parents, and then you reaffirm it later before you do the latter half of the heads assessment, because those are the social, what I frame as the social taboos, the things that is we don't generally talk about, drugs and sex and suicide and, those the great social taboos of harming your own body. And just to reaffirm it in that spot, they're probably I would say that's the most helpful thing. I think also that's an evidence-based thing to do. Stating confidentiality for a young person actually has quite good evidence. I think it's a New England Journal of Medicine paper that says a young person trusts you more, you're more likely to be seen as their secret keeper. They will share more willingly with you, and they believe that you're going to hold on to it.
It's strongly evidence-based.
I wrote those little 3 points down, don't worry.
Any other questions? Well, I would like to thank all of you for, it's amazing how at the end of one's career, you can still learn little pearls of wisdom and it's always really interesting to hear how other people do it and kind of go, oh, thank God I've been doing the right thing. But I have to say, all of you have extraordinary skill and extraordinary care, which is the most important thing, and passion for young people, and I applaud you for that, and I look forward to seeing how all of your work continues in the future, and thank you very much for all of you being here, and thank you for your presentations.